you all for inviting us here. We're super excited to be part of this group, and we learned a ton from listening to MetLife, and Todd and Kelsey set us up really well. Just by background, a way of background a little bit, both Mike and I are clinicians. We are physical therapists by training. In fact, I run direct what I call a population health clinic back on the East Coast. We've been in business for 25 years, and we have an integrated care model, and that's actually how the Sustainable Health Index grew up. The other hat that I wear is I actually direct a program in population health management for interdisciplinary teams out of the University of Montana. It's an online program because that's the way people learn these days. So I bring to the table a clinical background, an academic background, and a passion for helping people own their health. And so that's what we want to talk to you about today. But just I wanted to talk a little bit about Al Lewis. So, we had this great idea. My clinic has been using the Sustainable Health Index for over 10 years. It was a very internal process to help us better address the total wellness and health of an individual, and then we took that out to local employers. And then Mike and I met each other, or Mike stalked me actually, that's what he says.
True story.
He tracked me down at a conference and said, hey, I've heard you speak on this, and we had this opportunity in Alabama of all places, and I really want to go in there with the Sustainable Health Index. And we'll tell a little bit more about that story in a moment. But at that time, it wasn't really scalable. We were on Excel and SurveyMonkey, but it did the job. And so as we were going through the commercialization process, one of the people we met was Al Lewis. And Al Lewis is nobody believes the numbers, and he's a wonderful voice in the wellness space because he is such a skeptic, and he just debunks myths, one myth after another. And so when you have to go through a validation process, where Al Lewis is challenging you every minute of the day, and you survive, and he comes out and says, "You got it." It's a pretty good feeling. So anyway, we are firm believers in Al Lewis, and really understand the reason that the wellness industry has such a bad rep. So from there, I will start, and then hopefully if you have questions, and actually it's going to be interactive anyway. So I hope that you've got rather than your muffins out, you've got your words out.
Jennifer, can you lift the mic up a little bit?
Oh, sure. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So first question, what does it mean to manage the health of a population? And why is it important for employers? Let's start with the first half. What does it mean to you when you hear managing the health of a population? What does that mean to you?
Anyone can answer.
Yeah.
Reducing risk factors.
Reducing risk factors, okay.
Managing disease.
Managing disease. Clearly important, right? Because of costs. Changes in healthcare, we know, have put businesses in the middle of the healthcare business. So sometimes I just ask, how's your healthcare business going? But you're not in the healthcare business really, right? Except that GM spends more on healthcare than they do on steel. Starbucks spends more on healthcare than they do on coffee. We all have a lot at stake. So understanding how to manage the health of a population is critically important for all of us. So I'm just going to start with a little case study. 550 employees. Hopefully this is not your scenario, but maybe it is. The spend is $932 per employee per month. So they're spending upwards of $5.7 million a year on their health care. I show you this data map on disease risk. Red is bad. It means they are in their disease management program. They've got signs and symptoms. Yellow is okay, but what it really means is the signs and symptoms are silent, right? They have signs and symptoms, but they're silent, right? And then green is good. So if I gave you this data map, how would you think about managing this?
A lot of work to do.
You've got a lot of work to do. Where would you start your work?
55%.
You should start at 55%. How would you do that? They're silent.
Start with education and routine screening programs.
Okay, education and routine screening.
With incentives.
With incentives, okay. How do those incentives work for you?
The only way it would work is if you had proper tracking mechanisms.
Okay, all right. So incentives, blind incentives, but tied to tracking, tied to some specific actions. Yeah. Okay. One of the stories that we heard most recently was, incentives don't really work, so we finally just gave away a spa week at the end of the year, because that's what we didn't know what to do with our incentive dollars. So unlike tied to tracking, we just threw it away. Good. Most currently, many of the people that we talk to, they really are currently focused on reducing or managing that risk profile with dealing at a transactional level. So they want to lower their fixed costs, change care options. When you've got a bucket of healthcare spending where you've got these claims, the big claims bucket, and then sitting on top of it, you've got your fixed costs, whether it's your PBMs, your TPAs, your stop loss insurance, and we should be managing that. That's why many of you are here. We should be managing that well. It's a low-hanging fruit, and at a transactional level, you can see an immediate return on investment. But underneath that small bucket, there is a huge, deep well of medical claims, right? And even though we are, typically this is what this looks like for the employee too, right? Let me change your care options, let me shift costs, let me raise the deductibles, all of those things we understand have to happen. But none of those things are reducing the impact of the claims bucket itself. So how do we get at decreasing the number of claims and the cost of claims? How do we get at that 55% or that 51%, the rising risk? How do we make sure that they don't hit the claims deck? So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. You kind of gave it away a little bit, stole my thunder a little bit, but that's okay.
It's just setting you up.
You were setting me up, that's right. So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. The rules are the same. Red is signs and symptoms or poor behavior. Yellow is silent but rising risk, and green is pretty good. So the disease risk map for this particular company, is what you just saw. The 29, 55 at the end. I can't read. 16%. That is influenced by the data dials that you see to the right of that disease risk. It's influenced by fitness behaviors. It's influenced by movement quality. It's influenced by nutrition. It's influenced by stress, and stress, the data underneath the stress not only is the normal depression and anxiety, but it's also sleep, time management, and financial well-being. That's all tucked into that stress domain. So if you saw these data dials next to that disease risk, what might you want to do to start managing your disease risk? And
Stop serving muffins.
Excuse me?
Stop serving muffins.
Stop serving muffins. Yes. All right. Stop serving muffins. Good.
Who likes those muffins?
I heard the spinning roll was amazing.
It was.
So,
What else might you do?
again, anybody can answer.
Focus on the fitness and nutrition part.
Right. So now you have some focus on what you should be doing, right? Around wellness, right? And it's driving directly to your total data dial, right? So often we throw out a full menu or an endless menu of things, but it's not necessarily those things that are most relevant to your employee population. And if we make it too hard, if there are too many choices, then it's hard for people to make any choice. It's sort of this paralysis by analysis. And so, nothing gets done. So if you can refine the selection of choices down to the key elements, then you start to drive more towards success. And again, you have to track it towards, if you marry that with data tracking and incentives that are tied to the data tracking, then you start to set yourself up for success. What if the data dials were a little bit different? Same disease risk, different maps. Would your solutions be the same?
Focus on the stress and fitness.
Your solutions will have to be different. Every company's data profile is different. They're not the same, but we often have a one-size-fits-all wellness program. So now I'm just gonna deal with the elephant in the room. Why wellness program scams cost employers and harm employees, or as Al Lewis said, I want this one. Surviving workplace wellness with your dignity, finances, and organs intact. Okay? This is the, sorry, there was a line in here that I really liked, but it's not coming out to me, so, and I don't want you to throw muffins, so I'll move on. But here's just another workplace wellness produces no savings, and then this is the one that Bill sent out Sunday and said, oh no, there are gonna be questions around this. So, an $8 billion industry in the U.S., but a study recently published found that they don't cut costs for employers, they don't reduce absenteeism, and they don't improve workers' health. So perhaps it's because how we're approaching what this wellness solution is, okay? Managing the health of a population is not the same as wellness, the wellness industry. It's not how the wellness industry defines population health, unfortunately. But often what we're using is claims data, and then we have good disease management. We're very good at disease management. And then we do biometric screenings, we have gym memberships, and we have some portal resources. I'm not sure how that works if the stress is the main driver of that disease risk stratification. That sounds very familiar, right? Biometric screenings, gym memberships, some sort of portal thing. Okay? Does that work if nutrition is the driver and you're the one responsible for stocking the kitchen or the pantry? I'm not sure that even matters. In fact, we're in conversations, can I say this, Sodexo? I'm
Sure.
gonna say this, right? We're in conversations with Sodexo now. I don't know if you all know that Sodexo, they've got 500,000 employees worldwide. They have enough data to say, we're doing away with all medical screening for our pre-employment. They used to do biometric screening, all sorts of medical tests for pre-employment, and then trying to make sure that they avoided putting somebody in harm's way. They've done this for I don't know how long, 10 years? They have enough data to know it is irrelevant data, and they do nothing with it. So they're looking to replace their medical screenings with an online health risk assessment that assesses multiple domains of health, not just disease risk. It's interesting when you have a company that big that they can now say, we know that it doesn't work. It's fascinating. Another, again, biometric screenings, gym memberships, and portal resources. If movement quality, people can't move without pain. If that's your issue, if low back pain is preventing them from exercising, I'm not sure how the gym membership is really going to help with that. My point in all of this is to say that people and their health cannot be separated from their environment, it cannot be separated from their behaviors, their belief systems, and the barriers that they run into, which is actually very similar to what the MetLife data just was telling us, the story that MetLife was, trend analysis was painting for us. So I'm going to geek out for one moment, put my professor hat on for one moment, and explain to you what the social ecological framework is and why wellness fails as we currently use it and see it. The social ecological model was built in the 1970s and has been improved upon throughout the decades. And it is still the main framework around which public health and population health curriculum is built. But it is not how vendors act in the marketplace. What this says is that in order to impact health, you have to recognize that an individual not only has their personal belief system, but they're interacting in a social network, that's the interpersonal, who's around them. Lots of studies that say if you have family members or friends or a social network that are doing really healthy, making really healthy choices, you're likely to make a healthy choice. And if you're surrounded by people who are not making healthy choices, that's the direction you're likely to go. In addition to that, you have community and institutional factors, barriers, right? So if you're supposed to be exercising and there's no safe place to exercise or there's no safe place to walk, then you're not going to. And at a macro level, what are the policies? And in this case, we're talking about public policy, but what is the policy of the employer? Take that back down to the employer that's driving policy. It's important to understand this because there is 25 years of research in the academic and public health world that says if you do not address 3 of these levels, you will fail. So when you look at the stratification here and you think about the wellness kinds of things that you all have available to you or that you're making choices for your employees, how many different levels do you hit? Are you hitting at least 3? Or are you hitting 1 or 2 dot points, as our Australian friends call it, or bullets, within a single level? Just for your consideration, it's a lot to think through, but it is key. We can't ignore 25 years of research in the commercial world and expect to have different results. So, healthcare costs come down to beliefs, behaviors, and barriers, and influencing them is impossible without understanding them. So, beyond claims data, how do you get a complete picture of your rising risk or your population's health beliefs, behaviors, and barriers? Because once a claim hits the deck, it is too late to avoid the cost. So how do we get upstream, and how do we get upstream in a credible, actionable way? Here's what it means. Mike, you always do a great job with this slide, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
It's my favorite
It's
slide.
your favorite slide.
Because I sat for a long time believing that we needed to just take a look at our claims and we could understand our costs. And claims are awesome predictors of cost, but they don't help us affect cost because the equation's incomplete. Because if I'm going to look at just claims, I have to understand, like we were talking about, what risks drive those claims. But even farther than that, I have to really understand what the behaviors, the beliefs, and the barriers are for this individual. If I'm going to affect all the way down there at cost, I cannot leave this part out. And I think there's a real gap in our decision-making process right now because we don't have all the information we need. We've got some great information, and we do a good job managing people once they get into disease, but we have a really hard time of stopping people from jumping to different risk buckets. So that's my favorite story.
Back to the boring stuff. No. So when you think about claims data, you even think about biometric screening, which is how many of us do our risk stratification. It's lag data. It's hindsight data, right? So, and hindsight is 20/20. But what if you didn't have to wait? What if you could more routinely engage your employees and understand what their health status or their well-being status is? What if you could do that 4 times a year? What if you could do that monthly? What if you could do it at least twice a year? And what if the cost wasn't so prohibitive that you could routinely gather that data and make adjustments throughout the year? Gosh, our barriers clearly are not low enough, or our incentives aren't quite aligned, and you could real time start to change and adapt so that you can drive the behavior and influence the behavior that you're seeking. And savvy organizations will start to manage their costs by influencing employee behavior. Now, a lot of times, well, I'll just tell the story. Back in 2010, I was in an innovation summit in Washington, D.C., which is my hometown, which is why I'm crazy. Say that. And this is part of why I'm crazy, the story. Undersecretary of Health and Human Services was there doing a presentation on ACA, on Affordable Care Act, and talking about all of the structural changes that were coming, and electronic medical records and cost containment, and making sure that you couldn't order excessive tests, and all of those things, all in the sort of the provider and the structure bucket. And I asked the question of, well, when you're talking about managing chronic disease, I absolutely see, at a transactional level, how you are going to contain costs. But at the end of the day, we have to win the hearts and minds of individuals. We have to help individuals own their health to actually make changes. And she looked at me and said, well, that's Big Brother. We can't do that. Dropped the mic and walked away.
Good.
I'm like, okay, first of all, we're Big Brother in lots of ways. But that's sort of this, when you get to health, people go, whoa, we can't do that, that's Big Brother. But what do you think Target does? What do you think Amazon does? What do you think Walmart does? Every time you get online or Google and the ads start coming through, because they're tracking your behaviors, they are starting to understand your mindset, and they're trying to influence you. So we can do that in not a negative way, we can do that in a positive way, but we have to understand first. We have to start by asking our employees. The other reason why this is so important is that 80% of our health outcomes are due to non-medical factors. So this is sometimes a shock even for providers to hear, right? This is based on social determinants of health. So if you're talking about health outcomes, only 20% of it is based on, or is reliant on the actual medical care. So yeah, we should make sure it's awesome. We should make sure you're getting the best outcomes possible at the lowest cost, because if you screw up that 20%, and that's where we're focused, right? But we have this incredible opportunity in the other 80% of factors that directly influence health outcomes. We can have an impact there, right? That is where we can start to remove barriers, we can influence beliefs, and we can reward specific trackable behaviors.
Jen?
Yeah.
And the reason that is because of what they said earlier, is because we're on all the time, right?
Yeah.
Not only is it an opportunity, it's our responsibility now as employers to take a look at this in a more serious way, right? It's not all just about the vending machines, right? There's a lot of ways that we can influence and help people influence these other factors that are going to actually change their health outcomes.
So, do you have a way to take actionable steps to prevent emergent health issues from becoming claims? And maybe more specifically, do you have a way to take actionable steps on the silent majority, the mucky middle, to prevent those folks from hitting your claim stack? That's what we're trying to get to. Today, again, just a quick recap, today's typical approach to what population health management, which is not what it actually is, now that you have the academic background, right? I can give you all the diplomas now. Today's approach is that we collect retrospective data, so it's claims data, and even biometric screening is still lag data. And then we develop these siloed solutions, and we really don't have an understanding of what's driving our individuals, right? We don't have an understanding of what their behaviors, or, well, we may understand their behaviors, but we don't understand their belief system, we don't understand what their barriers are, and we are not promoting self-agency. The number one rule for getting individuals to own their health is we actually have to hand them the keys to the car, and we have to help them learn how to drive. Right now, there are typically very high barriers to participation, and the no claim for the mucky middle, that's the silent majority. I call it the mucky middle, but it's the silent majority. We gather this big data, and then we gain some population insights on that big data, the lag data, and then we start acting on the system. One of the things that, one of the meetings that Mike and I had not too long ago was with Express Scripts. Are you all familiar with Express Scripts? They are big data. They are big data in the way that none of us understand big data. What was it, petabytes or tetrabytes of data? They have so much data that they can predict who's going to become addicted to opioids by the socks they bought last week. You may have never filled a prescription, and they can predict whether you're going to become addicted. It was an awesome conversation. Their chief medical officer sat with us and said, yeah, I get what you're talking about, and you know what happens? When we run our algorithms and we start acting on the individual, we send them a letter. We send them a letter that says, hey, here are the dangers of being addicted to opioids, and you shouldn't ever fill a prescription on opioids. She said, you know what the typical response is to that? What do you think the typical response is to that if you got that letter? She's like, I get hate mail all the time. Those letters are signed by me. Of course I didn't sign them, but the system signs it by me, sends it out, and I get hate mail all the time. That is not promoting self-agency. That is not helping anybody, but it's how the system currently works. So what if it could work from the bottom up, right? Oh, sorry, I missed this. I totally missed this slide. I have to come back to this slide because we act on the individual, and then we do couple it with death, what I call death by 1,000 clicks. So this is how the traditional wellness program collects data. They begin with sort of this traditional HRA, and then the employer never sees it, the doctor never reads it, and it actually means nothing to the patient. And I'll just tell you that this is mine. This is from my Blue Cross Blue Shield provider. And I am highly motivated. Yes, it would make sense. This is my passion. First of all, it took me 6 clicks to even find where the thing was. And, I got the email that said I'm going to get an incentive, right? I'm going to get $600 off if I just do X, Y, and Z. So it found 6 clicks to get there, and then I filled out my health risk assessment, and I got a score of 82. It's not bad. 82 of what? Well, it's 82 of 100, okay. But what does that mean? What is it benchmarked against? What are my priorities? Because then they ask me to set my own personal goals. But I don't know what my priorities are because I have this score of 82 out of 100. I mean, some people get their age. What is it called?
Age adjusted?
No. It's like what's your health age or your real age or your well-being age, right? Whatever that.
You're
thing.
40, but it says you're 64.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I don't know what that means. It doesn't. It's an irrelevant piece of data that's floating there with no context. So, all right, I'm going to keep going. So I dive in and I click on my report because that will tell me what it means. Now, the report is a generic report that says here are all of the things it could be. No idea where you are because I just got your total score of 82 out of 100. So good luck interpreting it. And it was a 20-page report, by the way. Then I could click on my health resources, and I had this cornucopia of choices. I show you 6 here. There were 50 choices, and there were all the icons of all of the vendors that I could go to, all the wellness vendors that I could go to that Blue Cross Blue Shield had partnered with that could help me own my health. So first of all, I had to scroll through them all, and 4 of them were the same. Food, nutrition, or food and nutrition. I mean, I don't know what's the difference in all of these, so am I going to research each one of them? And then when I finally make my choice, then I get to log in and sign up with them, so they can start to engage with me. And then I can finally start on my behavior change. And I'm highly motivated. That is not low barrier to entry. That is incredibly high barrier to entry. So you want to know why wellness programs don't work? Because I don't want to do this. How many of the people in this room have filled out your insurance company's wellness program or HRA? All right, 4 of you, 5 of you. How many of you then engaged in the additional resources that they offer? How many of you even knew there were any additional resources? Okay, good, at least you knew, that was good, but it was a pain in the butt to get there. Probably, I shouldn't speak for you, maybe it was. Anyway, now, what if we had a different way? So talking about the missing piece, the bottom-up approach, can we deliver actual insight to the people who need the actionable insight, which is the individuals, the employers, and then they can decide the providers they want to bring in, so that we understand behaviors, beliefs, and barriers that separate people from their health, that prevent them from being their own agents, okay? So we can gain population-level insights into behavior patterns. We can also assess their readiness to change and their ability and confidence, which is activation. Right? Are you ready to change? Maybe you're ready, maybe you're not. If you're not ready, don't waste your time. You cannot convince somebody to be ready. But there will be people who are ready. Right? And then you can separate out readiness to change versus activation or confidence and ability. The number of times that Mike and I go into a company and they tell us what we're going to find, oh, those people are just lazy, they don't want to change. That's interesting. That's coming from the C-suite and the HR, they know. They're lazy, they don't want to change. Well, let's find out. We always find something very different. But the point of gathering that data is now the system, the employer, or the broker, or the vendors, can start to think about how do we lower barriers. Because if you develop a system that has the course of least resistance that leads to your desired outcome, that's the outcome that you'll get. But you have to design a system that lowers barriers, that creates, again, course of least resistance. If it is really hard to do all of this stuff, you're not going to do it. If the incentive is ridiculously far out, they're not going to do that. Somebody's not going to do that. We had a great, set of studies coming out of the University of Colorado looking at incentives, because the lore has been that incentives don't create self-agency. It means, they're just doing it for the money, but they're not really going to create a behavior change. And what they found is if you give somebody $1 a day for each time they, eat their fruits and vegetables or whatever the desired behavior is, and they get $5 at the end of the week, they are more engaged than the person, or they've accumulated $5 by the end of the week. They're more engaged than the person who gets $5 at the end of the week, right? And then when you look at it a year later, and you've removed the benefit, you've removed the incentive, the ones who got the dollar at the day, at the end of each day, they're still engaged in their behavior change. The one that did it for the big payout, or they tried the big payout, they were not still engaged in their behavior change. So again, how we design our incentives and what we're applying those incentives to matters. It's important. So, all the background to Sustainable Health Index. Sustainable Health Index, we call it an alternative HRA because I'm not sure what else we call it. It's an index, but it's very different from what is out there, so we'll call it an alternative HRA so that you all can kind of frame around it. But it gives you data that everyone can see, understand, and use to influence the health of a population. And rather than a portal that they have to go to, and a this and a that, it's delivered into the palm of their hand. It's very easy to answer. We've had a couple of people say, yeah, I was laying in bed answering. I was, brushing my teeth and going through the HRA. But it gives you an immediate map that an individual can understand. It's meant to kind of hit their brainstem and sort of have a visceral response, but certainly you don't have to have a degree to interpret the results. And then we can also, as soon as we get the individual data, we can roll it up to an aggregate level and share it with the employer. So, let me show you some maps. You probably guessed what we measure already, because we started with some of the more detailed data dials at the beginning. But we measure disease risk, which is probably the most traditional part of our HRA. We also measure fitness, we measure movement quality, we measure stress, and we measure nutrition. The idea is to collect the minimum data set in each of these domains because each of these domains actually influence disease risk, which influences your total health score. Why do you suppose we collect data on movement quality?
That could be one of the main barriers to two of your other ones.
You got it. If you don't move well, if you are painful and stiff, you're not going to exercise. So your gym membership isn't going to help you until you deal with what the issue is at hand. All right. So what you're looking at here is you see 3 different data maps or health insight maps. This is the summary map that individuals receive, and it is how we first present aggregated data to a company. We then dive into data dials at a company at an aggregate level. But an individual doesn't need the data dial because this is their health map. So these are 3 different companies or 3 different individuals. Their total health score is a 13. I'll just tell you now, we're like golf. We like golf, and so the lower the score, the better. 1 to 7 is your green zone. Your 8 to 12 is your rising risk zone, and your 13 and higher is your disease signs and symptoms zone. So these 3 companies have the same total aggregate health score. But their data maps are very different. Their health insight maps are very different. So the solutions you would even start thinking about should be different, yeah. So if I just ask, if you look to the map on your far left, center of the map, so the goal is to shrink the shape to the center of the map, right? Trying to hit the target. And depending on how you score or how your population scores, data points start getting outliers, start pulling the shape to the outside of the map, right? So the far left, what is that to tell you?
You work on their movement quality.
Right. So the disease risk is sitting at the top because that's the one that goes up and down like a dimmer switch, depending on what happens in the other domains, right? And keep in mind that there are certainly genetic predispositions to disease, but behavior in all of those other domains can impact whether or not those diseases get expressed. So you can't remove the gene, of course, but you can impact how frequently or how severely that gene gets expressed, okay? So yeah, the strategy on the far left may be, that may be your workforce that does a lot of manual labor, right? Well, maybe it makes sense to bring in some on-site physical therapy, or some way, or doing physical training in the morning to make sure that they're warmed up, or what have you. But that's a different set of solutions than you might see for the one, or might need for the one on the far right. Correct? Does that map resonate with any of you?
Stress?
Stress, right? And even your stress solution, when you dive into that, if we were at an aggregate level and we dove into that and we said, gosh, what's the stress? Most people would think, well, we need EAP, we need counseling or whatever. But often it's the financial stress, right? So that's a very different solution than anxiety and depression. What if it's time management? I've got too much to do, I don't have enough time to do it. What if it's time management training that you need? What if it's sleep education that needs to happen, right? The devil is in the details. Once you know the details, then you can start to build a wellness program, which is really managing to the needs of the population. So this is how the Sustainable Health Index works. We start with an index, and that point that we can, there's an immediate data collection. Typically, we give a population 2 to 3 weeks to fill it out, just to get everybody onboarded, because not everybody, surprisingly, responds to our email in that moment. So we give them some time. Once they've completed the index, they get an immediate map of their health, or an immediate insight map of their health. And they also get a total health score, and they also get their readiness to change score and their activation score. We can then aggregate that data so that we're able to present that data to the employer or the broker at a population level just as soon as, we can keep going. Just as soon as data is added in, we can keep updating the aggregate report. Separate from that, we have a communication hub. We call it the Health Hub because that communication hub is preloaded with an entire suite of health literacy adventures. Now, one of the things that happens, again, in the wellness world, the wellness vendor world, is that when you click on the resources, you get, most often you are sent to a video that looks a lot like this, where people are sitting in the room and they're nodding their heads and there's somebody talking to them, and everybody's just, okay, and it's completely not engaging. Hopefully this is more engaging for you all, but when you're watching a video of somebody lecturing on the importance of, exercise, it's not very compelling. So our goal is to really appeal to the brainstem. We are trying to appeal to the lizard. We want an emotional response to the data or to the information that we're delivering. And unlike sort of the cornucopia of choices, we're going to, in that Health Hub, we're going to ask, what adventure would you like to go on? And if they choose, financial management, then we're going to deliver a very curated experience. Small bites, funny, little tasks to do, and then we will connect out to resources. And hopefully those are resources that you all would like to connect with. You may have a vendor that is doing a local bank that's doing, financial literacy. If you don't, we connect out to national resources. So the Health Hub is what we preload onto the Communication Hub, but that Communication Hub you also can use. And so, just as MetLife was talking about, where employees are looking for lots of communication, kind of one-on-one communication, our secure chat function allows you to start that one-on-one communication somewhat virtually, and then you can filter to who needs the actual white gloves, hands-on appointments. It also allows you to build workflows where the individual feels like they're getting their personalized information because you have set criteria for this particular profile is going to get this information, or if they answer a question in this way, then they're seeking this information. You can automate much of that so that when you need to do your one-on-ones, in-person one-on-ones, you've filtered down so that you don't have to do it for everybody. It gives you a way to sort of manage and filter and prioritize or stratify the most expensive interventions or resources with a broader brush that can feel still more personal. So that's the index and the communication hub. So I want to go to some stories. This is our first endeavor together, where Mike and I went down to a rug manufacturing company in Alabama. 2,000 employees. They were living in a company town, so that company really was the economy of the town. Shift work. They had an on-site clinic, and that on-site clinic was really quite progressive because not only were they taking care of the employees, but they were taking care of all of the families because they understood that those families were riding on their health insurance and they were trying to contain the costs. There's one little trick. All employees were penalized for stepping off the line. So stepping off it's essentially an assembly line, right? You step off the line, you're penalized no matter why you're stepping off the line. So, when you go to lunch, when you take your bathroom break, when you go to the clinic, when you get it, you get penalized, you get a point assessed. And then when you accumulate a certain number of points, then you're put on notice, and then you have to, work those points off, and if you don't work those points off, then you're terminated. Just a little important when we talk about barriers, just keep that in mind, right? So their known health spend, $582 per employee per month, so they're $14 million a year. This is the breakdown of what their spend is: 63% on musculoskeletal, 11% on coronary artery disease, and you can meet the rest. Just a point of notice, 63% of their medical spend was on musculoskeletal, but their workers' comp claims were 0. We were told not to talk about that. Assumptions, this is what we were told. We were told that smoking and diabetes were their top priorities. We were told that this community was non-tech savvy and that they had to be seen in person. Mike, can you just talk about what happened the first time we toured the facility and what we saw in everybody's back pockets?
Well, you see phones everywhere.
Right. They were non-tech savvy, told that, they were not technically savvy, and they must be seen in person. So we have this really cool online app, and even though this was our first version out there, this was, I don't even think it was V1, it was V.5, and we were, this is the Excel spreadsheet sheet and SurveyMonkey married together, right? We had a 70% completion rate, which was really pretty darn good because they chose not to use the online delivery because these were not tech-savvy people and they needed to be seen in person. Barrier 2, right? You're penalized for stepping off the line, but you must be seen in person. So they onboarded individuals throughout the year, in-person, on-site clinic visits only. It took 9 months to collect the data. Think about your biometric screens. That's a heavy lift, right? Well, actually, you probably don't even know what the data is because you don't get the data. But they collected the data over the course of 9 months. And they chose not to collect any fitness or movement quality data because that wasn't important. So it broke the algorithm first. So there was no way that we could actually do a health insight map for them. So we tried to pull the data points out so that we could at least design it to help them understand their story a little bit more. But this is how the clinics or the clinicians, when they derived their assessment of kind of what the health status was, they're like, look, this doesn't work because 89% of our people are fine, and we know that's not true, right? So they were right based on their data collection. The data you collect is important. What's so interesting, and we get this all the time, people are going to lie on their self-reports. That's what we get hear that all the time. So let me just ask you, there was the clinician data dial, and here's the self-report from the employee population, those 2,000 employees. Which do you think is more true? Has more validity?
And that's just one question.
Yeah,
Right.
that is based
How
on
would you rate your overall health? Good?
There is incredible
Great.
research behind that question.
Right.
The research demonstrates again and again at a 95% confidence level that it's face valid, meaning that it asks, when you answer that question, it's actually reflective of the real situation, and that people actually respond accurately. So we got a better understanding of the distribution of of their health risk by asking that one question than the clinic did, the clinicians did. I would have taken 90 seconds if we just asked that one question. We didn't need any biometric screen. That's also why they wanted them to come into the clinic, because the vendor wanted to do the biometric screening. Why did the vendor want to do the biometric screening?
Get paid.
Yeah,
Money.
that's how they get paid. So then we wanted to dive into their tobacco usage and diabetes question. Their tobacco usage in this case, they were 34% were tobacco users, and 2% didn't want to answer, so they're considered tobacco users. So that's not a bad thing to have program around, that makes sense, right? Then on their diabetes, so 68% are actually pretty good. They have 0 markers for diabetes. 22% had markers for diabetes, so we were clearly clinically defined as pre-diabetic, and then 10% were clinically defined as diabetic. They chose to manage those that were really diabetic. Well, we don't want to manage all the diabetics, we just want to manage the ones that are really diabetic. I'm not quite sure, okay, how does that work when you look at your rising risk, you look at your healthcare costs? So they had no strategy for the 22% that were pre-diabetic, and no strategy for the 5% that are diabetic. They're just not really diabetic. Kind of like, are you pregnant or are you not pregnant? We just sort of. Anyway, so here were their essential opportunities, and we were ultimately able to summarize this for them in a kind of a messy way because the data was dirty, but we looked at it question at a time, and then we did look at their biometric data so that we could start to understand, since they didn't follow our, they didn't answer all of our questions. What we were able to determine was 65% of that population had metabolic syndrome markers, and they were not required to follow up in the clinic. They were ignored. So this particular company, if you triggered on tobacco, you triggered on really diabetic, you had to follow up in the clinic, but otherwise you did not have to follow up in the clinic. So they missed 65% who had metabolic markers. 74% of them were sedentary, which has huge implications for their chronic disease and musculoskeletal disease, and 56% had poor nutrition, and that was extrapolated from waist circumference data, which is a pretty good marker for what your nutritional intake is. That central adiposity is a pretty good marker for nutrition intake. So here are the structural barriers. Remember back to the layers that you need to try and address, right? They were going to take no change in approach. They continued to penalize people for stepping off the line. They had continued to have no program for musculoskeletal injuries, and they had no management strategy for 27% of the diabetic or the pre-diabetic population. So they looked at the data and they said, not interested. So they had a lost opportunity. $21 per member per month healthcare cost savings, or $500,000 decrease in their bottom line spend that they chose not to capitalize on. We learned a lot from that one.
We need to throw it in the trash.
First of all, we understood that we needed to scale it. We understood that we needed to go direct to the employee. We needed to make sure that provider bias was pulled out of the way, that any bias was pulled out of the way, that it wasn't, that we were just appealing to the hearts and minds of individuals, that we care about you. This is the first step in self-agency. So we designed, we're now on B, we're just about to release B3, and it is a direct to employee process, again, mobile adaptive, so that we can just speak directly to. So this is what we did with the new platform. This is now a large company, 515 employees. You heard this one a little bit, I set you up a little bit for it. Rural distribution, they actually work on the barge for 30 days. 30 days on, 30 days off the boat, and then when they're on the boat, they're 6 hours on, 6 hours off on their shifts. You know their known health spend. Here's the rest of the conditions that they're primarily dealing with. Again, we are always handed the set of assumptions, right? They are not tech savvy, we've heard that before. They are not interested in their health. What did they actually say?
No.
Okay. Not interested in their health.
Yes.
Unwilling to change. That's not what they said, actually. They used different words. But they did say, but the captains have a lot of influence. So that's what we walked in with. And here's what we found. So here's the index experience. The non-tech savvy people, rurally distributed, had a 93% index completion rate. Okay, now there's a story behind that. They were disincentivized, or they were penalized for not filling it out. Okay, they were docked $100 a paycheck until they filled out the index.
It was insane. They were calling us saying, I gotta get this. You know, I mean, it was not the way that maybe we would want it to go in, but the data is awesome.
93% completion rate, but I'm going to get back to that, to that in just a minute. I'm going to ignore the rest of those percentages for just a moment and direct you to the health insight map. And you did see this because we used it up front earlier. So, you know, if you're looking at this health insight map, then you're seeing outliers in
Nutrition.
disease risk, nutrition, and a little bit in fitness. Okay, and they got a total health score of 10. Well, you know, a little bit like that 82 out of 100. I'm like, I don't know, even 10. It's kind of in the middle. It's not so bad. So we're gonna dive into the details. That's where the data dials become very important at an aggregate level. Our goal in that total health score number is that we ultimately want to be able to turn ROI to determine an ROI for every point you decrease your total health score. We don't have enough data on that yet, but that's our goal. But now let's go back to they're lazy and they don't want to change. So readiness to change and ability and confidence. I mentioned that earlier, and it is something that we measure. Typically, when you are looking at a population, you're trying to hit a tipping point. If you hit 70% or higher in your population, then you know as an employer that you don't have to do quite so much to lower barriers, right? Because there's already a health ecosystem that is pretty engaged. We're not talking about every individual, we're talking about the population as a whole. If you are not at 70%, then you need to be on alert. And brokers, if you go in and you see you're not at 70%, we need to be having those conversations because the employer can't ignore the barriers they have in place. So that is true for readiness to change, and it is true for confidence and ability. So even though my goal is 70%, 64% on readiness to change is not bad, is it? It's close, you know, it's pretty darn close. So when you tell me that they're lazy and they don't want to change, I don't believe that. But I do look at the confidence and the ability, and this is a population that doesn't know what to do and they don't know how to do it. So we need to educate them, and we need to make that easy for them to do, right? Because there are 150 million resources on Google, right? You can Google anything. It's not lack of information that's a problem, but it's what do you do with it, and what's the right information, and what's credible information, and what do I, am I supposed to starve myself? Am I supposed to wear, plastic pants? What am I supposed to do, right? So giving them credible information that they can act on in small bites so that they're confident. Small steps, small wins gains confidence. So data dials, you should be pretty good at these now, right? So they're the total health risk score. We said was a 10, but devil is in the details, right? Because 22% are symptomatic and managing disease, 51% are rising, and 27% of this population are pretty good. Again, you look at the influence, the influenceable factors. You're looking disease risk, again, almost always matches or closely reflects the total risk. For the total health score, but we're talking about fitness, movement quality, nutrition, and stress, right? And so this is where this is the nutrition and the fitness maps that really came out as these are things that we need to focus on. So the company currently focuses their health spend management strategies on the 22% that are sitting in the high risk. That's the disease management program. And then they pay claims out as needed for the remainder of their population. But 51% of their population is knocking at the high risk door, it's rising. And if they do nothing different, 10% of those people will shift. They will shift to high risk. So that's a big difference, right? So if we can prevent those 10%, we don't even have to prevent all of them. We just need to prevent 6% of them from shifting to high risk, and we're going to start to save big dollars. And that's also something that Al Lewis talks about a lot, is that wellness vendors will come in and say, your tobacco population is 51 today. We're going to take that tobacco population down to 31. And they're going to look at that one cohort, and they're going to tell you what the return on investment is for that one cohort, that 51 that came down to 31. But they're not going to look at the
people that
25 that became new smokers. They're not going to look at that, right? And so that's why nobody can believe the numbers. That's why the ROI is so bad. Because they're looking at single cohorts saying, I'm going to change that cohort. Because those are the people that I'm intervening with on that high risk behavior. But they didn't do anything to manage the rising risk. That was left to the portal and the death by 1,000 clicks. Okay? So here are the essential opportunities for this company. 60% of their population is sedentary, 50% have poor eating habits, and 100% of them are sleep deficient when they're on the boat. So that just, we can pull out any particular data point and run that up to the top deck and see where that sits. Why that's important? There's incredible amount of data on sleep deficiency and health outcomes, and poor health outcomes, right? So we wanted to understand that. So here are the things that they have the opportunity to focus on. Improving fitness. What if you ran if that was your top deck, right? If that was what you chose to focus on for the entire year, and all of a sudden your wellness program became entirely focused on a fitness campaign, are you likely to change behavior now? Instead of 100 things, you're doing one thing, and it's the message that's coming from the C-suite, that's coming from HR, that's where your contests go, that's where your incentives are tied, not to the did you lose weight, but what are the exercise minutes? Can we have boats that are competing on exercise minutes? Can we have captains that are leading personal or physical training sessions in the morning? Can we use the influence of the captains to influence and provide opportunity for individuals? Those are the kinds of structural changes that we have to start to think about. Restocking the pantries, changing the nutrition. So they have a diabetes population that they're worried about, right? They're worried about their chronic disease management. But 3 years ago, they let go of all of the cooks on the boats because those cooks were $80,000 a year. But now they have a $200,000 per boat per year diabetes management problem, right? And why? Because they're stocking the pantries. And what's in the pantries? Fresh fruit is expensive. Fresh veggies are expensive. We run out of them. So what's in the pantry? Yeah, Wonder Bread.
They're a graham cracker away from s'mores.
Right.
And literally, the picture that we saw was a thing of marshmallows and a box of chocolate.
That was right. You took a picture of the pantry, like, there is that's a structural barrier, right? Now, not all employers are that way, but I know that when you're thinking about your environment, there are barriers that are there that just are being too hard to overcome. For this one, it was truly for them to look at their diabetes management issues and look at their pantry and understand that nutrition was one of their leading markers. They're like, I'm not sure how much more I can put that together for you, but that's the issue. And I can be out. I'm out. I don't have to do anything with that. If you just change your pantry and change the choices that are available while you have them captive for 30 days, they're going to start eating better. The other piece was the shifts, right? They're 100% sleep deprived. Well, that's because the industry standard is 6 hours on and 6 hours off. But you don't have time to sleep, eat, or exercise in 6 hours, right? You don't. So what happens if you change the shift? And this was a mind bender. Well, this is the industry standard. This is what we do. This is what we've always done. Okay. But if you did 8 and 12, and then 12 and 8, they'd have time.
4.
Sleep.
8 and 4.
Oh, sorry.
8 and 12.
8 hours on, 12 hours off. 12 hours on,
So
8 hours off.
Yeah, sort of. They do, like the Navy does 8, 4, 4, 8. Right? So you're on for 8, off for 4, on for 4, off for 8. Is that 8, 12?
No.
We'll talk about this. Why don't we talk about this later?
Offline.
Okay, muffins right there. Oh, goodness gracious. Anyway, but the point being that if you change the structure, you're still going to get the same amount of work from these people, but you've changed it so they can now sleep and eat and exercise, which is what they wanted to do. They were ready. They just didn't. Now, not only is it ability and confidence, it's like, I don't know how to do it. I don't know when I'm going to do it. I can't put it into my framework. That was a big one for them. That was really, and by the way, they've done none of these things because we collected this data 6 months ago, and then they decided they were going to sell the company. So it's okay. The one thing they did do is they kept the health hub. They flipped on the health hub, and they said, you know what? That's a low-hanging fruit. I'm just going to flip on the health hub because I don't have to think about all the rest of this. And what you don't know is I'm trying to package the company up to sell. So I'm not going to make any of these big structural changes. So back to the non-technical, non-tech savvy, they're not interested in changing, they're not interested in engaging, and what do you see there? Beyond the penalty, phase, which was filling it out, 65% of them stayed engaged on the platform for at least 2, if not 3, of the education stacks, those health adventures, right? So they stayed engaged without penalty, and they started talking, right? They started secure chatting, and we passed all of the secure chats to the nurse advocate, and all of a sudden the nurse advocate was starting to connect with people that she had never connected with before. She was going down the disease management list. But the people that were calling in or messaging in were the ones who said, I need 2 knee replacements, but my doctor won't do it because until I lose, 100 pounds. I don't know how to do that. Connect. My doctor wanted to change my medication, and I don't trust what this medication is. What do I do with it? Connect. Right? The amount of things that started to happen on that secure chat just because, right? It was there because that's how they're familiar with interacting, right? And they got a message back. You know what? That's a really important question. Let me connect you to Mary. Mary is the nurse advocate. She's going to be giving you a call. Now you have your white gloves treatment, but you have a way to funnel it. So that's what we learned. And I'll stop there. I have a little video to show, but I just am going to open the floor to questions first. Or thoughts, or, marinations.
So if you don't have prisoners for 30 days, how do you recommend influencing like their home life?
Yeah, so all of the videos that we show, part of why we deliver videos is that they can share with their friends and family. We want them to share with their friends and family, but so that's sort of how the app approaches it. But how do you, as an employer, start to do that? So I think it ties into incentives, right? So for example, if you, the employee, go through 3, let's say fitness is your primary thing, and you don't want them to look at anything but fitness first, okay? So we can design it so that they get all of the fitness content first, right? If you provide incentives for finishing modules, if you will, little modules, right? And if you complete 30 modules in 30 days, and again, these are 5-minute modules, right? For you, you get, X amount. If your family does it, they get Y amount, right? So that you start, what you're trying to do is educate, right? The more you educate and the more you entice people to participate, that in and of itself will start to lower your costs. So that is one way that we would think about doing that. That you want the learning process to involve not just the individual, the employee, but you want to include their family. So when you think about the incentives, when you think about who you're including in that, you want to include in the engagement process the members of the family as well. Is that helpful?
Mm-hmm.
Great question. Do other people have ideas too? Because you all have been out in the employer space a lot longer than I have.
Just a quick question. I'm just curious what your opinion of the Juul movement for tobacco. Is the question typically asked, are you a tobacco user? And I've had some interesting discussions with the youth, put it at that this is not harmful and this is not tobacco use. And many times the questionnaires ask tobacco use, and they're saying no. I'd just be curious, it seems to be a pretty big movement.
Yeah, so we ask about, do you chew, do you vape, do you anything, do you inhale, we are pretty specific around that. The vaping epidemic is just that, it's an epidemic. And the literature is starting to come out now. It is going to be a huge health crisis. Because you're inhaling, depends on what's in there, but you're inhaling those particulates directly into your lungs. Yeah, it's going to be huge. So it's a bad habit. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions? I'd love to know if it makes sense to think about managing the health of your population. Does that distinction between that and wellness make sense to you all? Does it feel like an insurmountable barrier? Or do you feel like if you had a little bit more insight into what your people were thinking and how your people were their confidence, their readiness to change, where they felt their issues were do you feel like it would be easier to start to craft a program? Yeah.
We have various size employers in the room. What's the average size employer that you're working with, and how small you typically?
Oh, we can go, so for us, we can go from 2 to 500,000, you know, it is completely scalable from our end. And we configure the, you know, sort of the navigation system so that it is specific to an employer. So a large employer might have multiple locations, and they might have, you know, a set of preferred providers in Illinois and a set of preferred providers in Indiana, thank you. I needed a another Midwestern state. Sorry, I froze there for a moment. So we can configure the system. If you're a smaller employer, you may not have any additional resources, and then we would, you know, maybe work to find some community partners that you could navigate to, or we would navigate to national resources. So for us, it's any size. When you're looking for return on investment, really the dollar return on investment, sort of that becomes more apparent if you have a larger spend, right? The smaller you are, then sometimes that, you know, 50% of 100 is 50, right? The 50% of a million is, so that's where you'll see the changes in the return on investments and what it kind of viscerally feels like. But it's certainly, you'll be able to engage individuals regardless of size from our perspective.
As we talked about, there's 4 or 5 generations in the workforce now. Do the barriers in, I guess, the health assessment break it down that way?
We don't break it down. We don't break it down by generation, but we could, right? So we certainly could run that data in that way for you, so that you know, we can run it by department, we can run it by age brackets, we can run it by lots of different characteristics. So, you know, just as you saw, we pulled the sleep deficit forward. We could pull data dials forward on kind of generational maps. And I guess I should have shown that I deleted one of our examples. We were looking at students and 2 different classes of students, and we looked at the data by first years and second years. And it was very different data. And so it was really important to do, because when you looked at it in totality, it wasn't as clear. But when you separated it out by first year and second year, there was an obvious trend that was apparent. So yeah, it's a great question.
I was just curious, with any of the employers that you've worked with, have you had, and I know there are probably incentives involved, like there were in this last example, to encourage participation. Have you ever run into employees not really wanting to provide that basic survey information?
Sure.
And
Sure.
how do you get past that barrier, so to speak?
Right, absolutely. So what your goal is you want to be able to collect at least data on at least 70%, right? Because again, on an individual basis, if I don't collect your data, I can't help you. But on an aggregate level, if I can collect 70%, remember I only need to prevent, you know, that rising risk. I actually only need, and there's typically a 10% shift, and I just need to limit it to a 4% shift. I don't have to hit everybody. But if I don't hit everybody, then we have to be more effective at the people that we do hit.
And I think too, it depends greatly upon your messaging and communication before rollout, right? Right. When we had the company we just talked about that was disincentivized, it was fill it out or. But there's another strategy that we can employ, right? That this is a benefit, right? We want you to have knowledge about yourself so that you can manage yourself. We've partnered with SHI to give you this cool, slick, fun app to try out. You know, so a lot of it has to do with the messaging before. You know, you can have launch campaigns, and you know, there's a lot of different discussions that we've had about how to smooth that transition.
The other piece is that the more you use the communication hub to communicate your benefits, your other benefits, gosh, we're going to send a little video out on, you know, all of those other benefits, or we've just added a new benefit. The more you use the communication hub to communicate via direct messaging, via email, via text, the more people will start to hop on the system, right? So that's also part of the structural change. If you want adoption, I can't as a vendor come in and say, I'm gonna guarantee this kind of adoption rate. But I can tell you that if you start using that communication hub for things well beyond our health literacy campaigns, they're gonna start logging in. And then, by the way, they're gonna get that information as well. Yeah.
Jennifer, we've been doing this for years at our place.
Yeah.
And our participation's high, we do pay an incentive. We've got some good, we think, return on the investment.
That's right.
It's going a little stale
Mm-hmm.
because we're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
For somebody who's been doing this for the last 8-10 years,
Right.
how do you excite this? How do you get this back to where the employees, they're all participating. I mean,
That's
I
awesome.
would say our participation's 90 plus.
And do you mind sharing what kind of tactically what you're doing?
We do the biometrics, we do coaching calls, depending on how many risks you have. You'll get more calls during the year.
We do the HSA biometric screenings.
Yeah, and it's all tied together. You talk about the internet stuff. We do all of our online annual enrollment through the internet, and that's all very interactive based on the individual as well. But we need more zing at this point.
Yeah. So I think, that's where, when we approached developing SHI as kind of a patient-friendly, again, our goal is to self-agency and winning the hearts and minds of individuals, and a lot of times we're going into places where they aren't already so highly engaged. You know, that app experience, what that feels like, that sense of, gosh, this is just like Instagram or Twitter or, you know, texting, that's what we're trying to create. And then the content, I mean, you can update that, we load it in with, again, all of our content is pretty tongue-in-cheek. It's got a sense of humor to it, but that starts to change things up a bit, and then you can constantly increase that or change that content. So we have a development, content development roadmap that we'll add things in, but you all can add things in as well. So I think that's part of it, is just keeping things fresh and new and relevant, and with that online capability. And again, it being delivered into, it's like an Instagram feed, if you will, right? Oh, what's the latest thing on Instagram? Let me click on that. That's what we're trying to do, and that's how we have approached trying to keep things more relevant and contemporary.
And there might be some information garnered from the data that allows you to bring in something new.
Right.
That, we always think we have all these boxes covered, right? But, the data is really telling in the sense that, we have a lot of assumptions based on biometric data. It doesn't necessarily get into the current behaviors and the beliefs of folks. And so coming out with something new from the data might help you liven it up a bit.
Well, and I think too, what I think is so awesome about what you're talking about is so often people collect biometric data, and I get why people do it. There's a lot of research out there that suggests that hold on, wait a minute. That's what this book is about, is whether or not we should be really doing all of that biometric testing. But what I like about what you just said is that you follow it up. Often it's a once-a-year collection and nobody follows up and does anything with it, so that's already awesome. But what about the people who don't trigger the coaching calls? How do you engage them? How do you know that they're not just low risk by luck, or they're not rising, but it's not tripped the clinical, because you're going to set some criteria before you get a coaching call. You're going to set some criteria. So if and you should continue to do that if that's working for you. But what about the people who haven't quite triggered yet? So there are people that are creeping up. They haven't hit your trigger, but you can still start to engage them in a way that is not, it's brand new for them because they haven't been called into that, cycled into the health coaching piece. So then I think that's how you start to maybe liven it up a bit, get more people talking about it, compare health maps. That's what we often find is when people start doing their health maps, they're like, oh, what did you get? What did you get? What did you get? Because they're all like snowflakes, they're all different.